Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about poet Jeanette Armstrong and specifically her poem History Lesson, which was written in 1991. So Jeanette Armstrong was born in 1948 on the Okanagan Reserve in British Columbia. She received a Diploma of Fine Arts from Okanagan College and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Victoria. Armstrong's main goal in writing is to educate young people about Native culture and history. She is the director of the Inawakan Center, a cultural and educational organization operated by the Okanagan Nation. In 1989, she helped to found the Awanakan School of International Writing, which is the first credit-giving creative writing program in Canada to be managed and operated expressly by and for First Nations people. So we're going to talk more about her poem History Lesson, that is a sort of a post-colonial critique of a traditional or conventional history lesson. So it's going to sort of talk back against or write back against the colonialist mindset and history, and give a sort of alternate portrayal of history from what you would read in the textbook. Okay, so let's start just by reading the poem. So, History Lesson by Jeanette Armstrong. Out of the belly of Christopher's ship, a mob bursts, running in all directions, pulling furs off animals, shooting buffalo, shooting each other left and right. Father, meanwhile, waves his makeshift wand, forgives saucer-eyed Indians, red-coated knights gallop across the prairie to get their men and to build a new world. Pioneers and traders bring gifts, smallpox, Seagrams, and Rice Krispies. Civilization has reached the promised land. Between the snap, crackle, pop of smokestacks and multicolored rivers, swelling with flower-powered Z, are farmers sewing skulls and bones, and miners pulling from gaping holes green paper faces of smiling English lady. The colossi in which they trust, while burying breathing forests and fields beneath concrete and steel, stand shaking fists, waiting to mutilate whole civilizations, 10 generations at a blow. Somewhere among the remains of skinless animals is the termination to a long journey, an unholy search for the power glimpsed in a garden, forever closed, forever lost. Okay, so let's take this poem from the start and unpack some of what Armstrong is trying to do or say in her revised or revision of a history lesson. So the best way to do this, I think, would be to look at this poem stanza by stanza and try to unpack some of the historical allusions that are used in this poem. So if you remember, an allusion is an indirect or direct reference to either another text. It could be a historical event that took place. It could be a person or a political event. So something that exists and is being referenced in the poem would be an allusion. So that's what we have here in the very first line. So out of the belly of Christopher's ship. So the name Christopher should ring some bells with you. So Christopher Columbus, we can assume, and the ship being his ship being the Nina, the Pinto, and the Santa Maria. Christopher Columbus is, as we know, a famous explorer who is often credited as kind of the father of the New World, so discovering the Americas. So that he's sort of seen as like a forefather in the history books to the colonial expansion of the Americas. So here we have a depiction of this ship meeting the land for the first time, and then out of the belly of the ship, a mob bursts out, running in all directions, pulling furs off animals, shooting buffalo, shooting each other left and right. So the explorers, the settlers of the New World are depicted here as very ravenous and brutal and quite savage. And we have an allusion here again to the fur trade as well. So they're pulling furs off animals. And it's a very sort of destructive description of this colonial expansion and how they took, appropriated, and used the land for their own benefit, took the animals' furs right off their backs, and then shooting buffalo and shooting each other as well. So they are described in here in this stanza as very kind of destructive, these first explorers. And the name Christopher, she doesn't call him Columbus, which might be a little bit of a kind of a way to take away some of his sort of notoriety or his authority, I guess, calling him by his first name instead of saying Christopher Columbus. She just calls him Christopher. So it is somewhat already challenging what a sort of historical depiction of Christopher Columbus coming to the New World and bringing sort of civilization and establishing the fur trade. It's a lot more destructive and damaging in Jeanette Armstrong's description of it. And then second stanza, Father meanwhile waves his makeshift wand, forgives saucer-eyed Indians. So we have to unpack that a little bit. So Father meanwhile, we can kind of read into that. Father maybe representing a kind of religious figure. You know, you'd call your like a priest father. So it does represent a kind of Christian influence on the New World. And the makeshift wand, if we can read a little bit more into that, it could be a cross, a crucifix, and he's sort of forgiving saucer-eyed Indians. So it's sort of this, the presence of a new religion in North America and already establishing somewhat of a sort of dominant position, waving this makeshift wand. They don't even know what to call it, right? It's just a wand, a stick, or a symbol, but we can read into that as being like a cross or a crucifix. And then we don't know why they're forgiving the saucer-eyed Indians, who sort of are described here as, you know, being wide-eyed, looking on, maybe bewildered or unsure or confused by what this father means to be doing. So it's sort of the presence of not just the fur trade, but we also have this religious impact, this religious influence coming in with colonization. And then the second part of the stanza, red-coated knights gallop across the prairie to get their men and to build a new world. The red-coated knights, we can also interpret that allusion. So the red-coated knights could be describing the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in their red coats, as we imagine, riding horses. So they are also, so we've had the explorers who first discover the new land. We have the religious influence of sort of Christian missionaries spreading religion, Christianity, and then here we have a sort of presence of law enforcement with the red-coated knights who gallop across the prairie. So there is this kind of chronological order still being held up in terms of this retelling of history. And then we have pioneers and traders bring gifts, smallpox, Seagrams, and Rice Krispies civilization has reached the promised land. So in addition to explorers, missionaries, law and enforcement, so the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we also have pioneers and traders bringing gifts. And the gifts there, we can unpack that. So there's a bit of humor here. So smallpox, Seagrams, and Rice Krispies. We can read into that. These aren't exactly gifts that are beneficial. In fact, smallpox ravaged the First Nations population, and that was brought over by the colonial pioneers. And Seagram's is, I don't know if it's around anymore, but it was a name brand of kind of alcoholic beverage, Seagram's coolers or wine coolers. And then Rice Krispies we know as a cereal, but it could also represent maybe that highly refined diet that we most associate with sort of modern day eating habits, refined sugar, refined flour, not very healthy. So all of these so-called gifts are destructive. So there's some irony in Armstrong's voice as she's sort of conveying this history lesson in a very negative light and saying that, these are very negative aspects of so-called civilization, right? And it wasn't really civilized. The people who came over weren't acting civilized, even though that's what they were sort of presenting themselves as being. But they brought, very destructive influences, violent, and pillaged the land and brought devastation upon the First Nations people living here already. So it wasn't a very positive change or expansion in the colonial expansion in North America. Okay, so if we continue on, there is more critique of a kind of history of North America. So we have between the snap, crackle, pop of smokestacks and multicolored rivers, swelling with flower-powered Z, are farmers sowing skulls and bones and miners pulling from gaping holes green paper faces of smiling English lady. So here there's sort of the environmental impact of industrialization and another way that across time, across history, the influence of settlers has had a negative impact, especially environmentally, in this stanza. So the snap, crackle, pop, which is reminiscent of Rice Krispies from the previous stanza, is the sound not of food but of smokestacks. So we have this indication of, industrialization and pollution. And I think that goes along with the multicolored rivers too. It could be, pollution in the water system, possibly, but you might have other interpretations of that line, multicolored rivers. It could also be maybe an allusion to like the Red River that was so important during the fur trade and was important to the First Nations communities that lived in areas of Manitoba. And then swelling with flower-powered Z. That one's a little bit more tricky to unpack. But these rivers swelling with flower-powered Z. Flower power sort of comes from the 1960s hippie movement. But you could see this as being so between the smokestacks and these rivers, you have the farmers who are sowing skulls and bones, which sounds like, there has been a lot of death in this land, and the farmers are just sort of going about their business, ignoring the remnants of other people's lives that were lost. And the skull and bones is often a kind of symbol of pirates. So it could also be that, an indication that those people who came, the colonialists or colonists came, were almost like pirates, ravaging the land and destroying and taking without, basically pillaging the land and destroying the people on it. And then we have farmers and miners pulling from gaping holes green paper faces of smiling English lady. So this would be all the people making money from the land. So the green paper faces being the money, and the smiling English lady being the queen on our money. So these are indications that a lot of people are making money off the land, exploiting it, using it for their own selfish gain, without considering some of the environmental ramifications of that. And then we have next stanza, the colossi in which they trust while burying, breathing forests and fields beneath concrete and steel, stand shaking fists, waiting to mutilate whole civilizations 10 generations at a blow. Okay, so if you look up the word colossi, it sort of refers to something monumental. And I think here in this case it's referring to sort of the British Empire that's been that colonized North America and Canada in particular. So that's, I think, what's being referred to. So this colonial empire in which all of these settlers, pioneers trust, and then as they trust in the empire, they're burying the forest, the fields underneath concrete and steel. So this is another description of the industrialization and exploitation of natural resources and the destruction of the environment, all for economic means, right? So people are profiting through concrete and steel, destroying the environment, and obviously this is an ongoing thing that we see in Canada, where the natural land environment is being destroyed for economic reasons. And then stand shaking fists, waiting to mutilate whole civilizations 10 generations at a blow. Could be another allusion to the destructive effect of colonialism on First Nations peoples. To mutilate whole civilizations 10 generations at a blow. It could refer to the impact of residential schools, where you have, generation of those individuals who are affected by, they were affected by, the introduction of smallpox, now the introduction of residential schools, and all of these events really having a destructive impact on First Nations communities, in terms of generation after a generation being affected negatively. So we have that possibly being referred to in that stanza. And then at the end, somewhere among the remains of skinless animals is the termination to a long journey, an unholy search for the power glimpsed in a garden, forever closed, forever lost. So it's quite a sort of sad close to this poem, where you have this forever closed, forever lost, what could have been kind of sentiment. So had, the colonial explorers or pioneers or settlers not have come to North America with their mindset of bringing so-called civilization and exploitation and destruction and violence, perhaps there would have been a different process, a different history that was written. However, we're stuck where we are with this history that's, a brutal reminder of how violent and destructive the colonial history has been. And what remains is something's been lost, right? Forever closed, forever lost is the potential that was once in the land and the people who lived here, and what could have been. So somewhere out there remains possibly a glimpse of this Eden. I think the garden always seems to represent an Eden, a utopia or a vision of beauty and harmony that could have been, that's been lost, forever closed. So there's no way to get back to that harmony with nature that once or could have been. Instead, we're sort of stuck with this history of so-called civilization and all the destruction that that's brought. So this poem, if we look at it in total, it's quite a strong critique of the colonial history of North America and Canada in particular. And it does illustrate many of the negative effects of colonialism on the environment, on First Nations people, and in general, the exploitation of resources and the violence and destruction that colonization has inflicted on others. So that's where I think we get the strong revision of history. It's a history told from a different perspective, not the kind of history you would get in a history textbook, but one that is a lot more critical of what happened. So it's a revision. And in this sense, it's could be placed as a kind of post-colonial narrative, writing back against a kind of whitewashed history and really giving more truth or critique of the events that played out and how destructive they were. So that's what we can look at for history lesson. If you were analyzing this one, you could talk about illusions, you could talk about imagery. There's some interesting irony in the sense of humor that's also a part of Jeanette Armstrong's voice. So you could talk a lot about some different things in this poem.